All right, we're ready for 2 Kings chapters 13 and 14. 2 Chronicles 24. We're going to cover those first 14 verses, even though we're slated to start at verse 15 and go through 26. So we have a little ground to cover, but much of that overlaps. So we're not covering every verse of every chapter. Let's review where we are and where we're going. I know Micah normally teaches this class, but he is in Arkansas for Thanksgiving with his family. So this is the outline we're following in the young adult class in the back. First and Second Kings together, grouping the books together, three major points: the reign of Solomon, the divided kingdom, and then the southern kingdom in exile. And we're in the middle of that, and that is we're in the southern kingdom in exile. Not in exile, but the divided kingdom section, chapters 12 of 1 Kings through 2 Kings 17. So that's where we are. Let's review our chapters, where we've been. Micah's titles to those chapters may differ, but we'll get to the same point. Chapter 1, what was it about? It's 2 Kings now, not of 1 and 2 Kings. We're only reviewing 2 Kings. 2 Kings 1, what's... Ahaziah, yes. Death of Ahaziah. Chapter 2. Yes, Elijah departs. Now that's going to be important because we're going to go back and talk about that a little bit tonight because of a statement made about Elisha, or to Elisha. Same statement was made to Elijah at his departure. All right, chapter 3. All right, very good. The rebellion of Moab. Chapter 4. Yeah, 4 miracles of Elisha. And so here are the miracles that establish that he indeed is a man of God and that he is equal to the work of Elijah. See a little more about that in our study tonight. Chapter 5. Yes, the healing of Naaman. Chapter 6. Another evidence of Elisha. Yeah, the axe head being recovered and then the dealing with the Syrians. It wasn't just a matter of dealing with the Syrians, but how they were dealt with and the miraculous things that took place. So really those 3 chapters go together in my mind as a unit of chapters establishing Elisha as a man of God. Chapter 7. All right, very good. Chapter 8. All right, yes. The woman of Shunem and the death of Ben-Hadad, the king of and kings of Judah are dealt with there. Chapter 9. Jehu's reign over Israel. And then chapter 10. All right. And chapter 11, we got 2 more chapters to go. We have Jehoash or Joash reign. We talked about him last week, and we will talk more about him in our study tonight. And then chapter 12 does much the same thing, talks about his reign. Let's go to questions for tonight. Summary of 2 Kings chapter 13. All right. All right, very good. Those are all dealt with in chapter 13. 2 Kings 14. Yeah, Amaziah, the reign of Amaziah and Jeroboam the second, or some call him Jeroboam B, because he's not the Jeroboam that's mentioned at the beginning of the divided kingdom. Not the same man. All right, well, let's pause there. Let's go one more. Question number 3, that should be 2 Chronicles 24. What does 2 Chronicles 24 deal with? It's on the screen. We can read. Do what? Yes, repairing the temple. So this is Joash, the reign of Joash of Judah. There's a Joash in Israel. There's a Joash in Judah. This is the reign of Joash in Judah. And this is where we're going to start. In the class that I'm teaching in the back, we usually go with Kings and then look at Chronicles only as it parallels. But we're going to start with 2 Chronicles this time, chapter 24. We're going to go then to 2 Kings 13 and 14. And then come back to 25 and 26 of Chronicles. So let's start right here. Now, in the class I taught last week, which is in the back, we dealt with just briefly this repairing of the temple, but I want to go back and summarize what we have in the first 15 verses. So we'll follow this outline here, 2 Chronicles 24. So this is Joash as he repairs the temple. He is from Judah. Now, I'm not sure what you're doing out here in the adult class, but we are trying to follow somewhat the order of the kings and kind of keep at least a mental perspective. We have the United Kingdom, then the divided kingdom, and as that continues, here are the kings, the ones that are circled are the ones we're talking about in our study today. The Judah, the southern kingdom, we have Joash, that's where we are. That's where we're going to be talking about. There is a Joash, a Jehoash, that's also in the north, in the northern kingdom, Israel, but we're talking about the kingdom of Judah. I want to go on, and I also like looking at this one. Here we are right here, and what I like about this timetable is we have the number of years that he's mentioned. I don't know if you can read that or not, but this is the king that we're dealing with. Let me zoom in and show you what we're talking about. He reigned for 40 years. He began at 7 years old. He is, the G and the B stands for good or bad. This, at least the author who put this together, labeled kings as being good or bad, or good and bad. I mean, they did some good and they did some bad. It's hard to be good and bad at the same time, but it's rating the kind of work that they did is actually what they're doing. So he was a good and bad king. So he reigned for 40 years. So let's go to chapter 24, and let's talk about repairing the temple and work quickly through this, and then we'll get to 2 Kings 13 and 14, some practical things there. But we're going to learn some practical things right here. 2 Chronicles chapter 24. He was 7 years old when he began to reign, and how long did he reign again? For 40 years. And so he's in the south, he's in the kingdom of Judah. Verses 1 to 14 focus on repairing the temple. I've tried to point out some things that are not mentioned in the king's account. Verse 3 is not found in the king's account to my knowledge. That is that Jehoiada, who is Jehoiada? The priest, he's the high priest. He found 2 wives for Joash. That's mentioned there. Look at verse 5. That after some time had passed, verse 4 said he sought his heart to repair the temple. And what instructions did he give? Told the priest, get the money together to repair it and do it quickly. And so they did not do it quickly. And that's not mentioned in the king's account. That they didn't do it is not, but they didn't do it quickly is not mentioned there. Now drop down to verse 6, that he called Jehoiada the priest and said, why have you not repaired the temple? And verse 7 tells us why the repairs needed to be done. Why do the repairs need to be done? All right, yes, the sons of Athaliah, that wicked woman we talked about in our study last week, her sons had broken into the house of God and desecrated the temple, and they took the dedicated things and gave them to the house of the Baals, and so consequently that work needed to be done on the temple. So look at verse 13 now. They finally get the money together, and verse 13 says, the work was completed and the house was restored to its original condition. We're not going to take the time, but there's a lesson within that of restoring something. And there are times we all need to be restored. If one is not a Christian, they need to be restored to the condition they were in before they became a sinner. That's reconciliation. If you're an erring child of God, you need to be restored to the condition you were in when you were a faithful child of God. But it's interesting that phrase is used here, that they restored it to its original condition. And then they did something else. Strengthened it or reinforced it. And so when you are restored to your original condition, then strengthen yourself. And there's a practical sermon there somewhere, I think. Now, beginning at verse 15 now, let's move on. His apostasy. What happens here? Jehoiada. What happened to Jehoiada first? He died. He's an old man, which may explain why some commentators suggest, cut him a little slack by saying that maybe because of his age, being at the time that he would have been between 90 and 100 years old or older, at the time of collecting the contribution and taking care of the temple, that maybe it was because of his age is why he was dilatory with reference to that. I don't know. I'll leave that for you to determine, and I just throw that out as one possibility. But be that as it may, he's old, he passes, and he was buried in the city among the kings because of all the good that he had done, yes. Now, verse 17, after the death of Jehoiada, the leaders of Judah came and bowed down before the king. Now what? He listened to them. What does that tell you? He took counsel of the wrong people. Now, let's stop for a moment. Here's a very practical thing. Joash, who's we're talking about, he's the good and bad king. He was good as long as good advisors. He had Jehoiada telling him what to do. As long as Jehoiada was by his side telling him, this is the direction we need to go, here's what needs to be done, he goes in that direction. As soon as he's gone, he turns and takes the advice and listens to the wrong people. Here's the lesson we learned from that. Some people are followers and not leaders. Would you agree with that? What's the danger of being a follower and not a leader? You're easily swayed. Very good. What else?
You're led. You're not directing your own footsteps. Someone else is directing your own
All right. Absolutely. So typically, you've seen this happen many times. Somebody who is, they're followers, they're not leaders. Maybe it's a young person, and we're going to make application to older as well, but it may be a young person. As long as they're with the right crowd, they go in the right direction. But as soon as that somehow fades and they're in the wrong crowd, they go with whatever that crowd's doing. Happens to older people as well, to husbands and to wives, they do that. So they follow those who are around them. Have you ever seen somebody who is faithful? They're only faithful while they have a leader. Have you ever seen families that you thought everything was going well in the family, and as soon as the woman in the family dies, she was the glue that held it all together? Sometimes it's the man, sometimes it's the woman, sometimes it's a child. But as soon as they're gone, the family kind of dissipates, and it doesn't have, their leader is gone. They don't have anybody telling them which direction to go, and so they're followers and not leaders. Joash was that way. He doesn't have a sense of direction for himself, and so Jehoiada's telling him the direction to go, and he's good with going there. But as soon as Jehoiada's gone and these other men saying, this is where we need to go, okay, let's go that direction too. So here's a practical thing. If you were to die, what would happen to your family? Are they going to fall apart because you are the leader? Or what if your mate or your child or your parent died? Is things going to fall apart because you're a follower and you're not a leader? That's a good, if we don't get any further, we've got that's a powerful point, I think, for us to learn. Now, let's go further. He listened to them. Now, what did he do because of that? Bow down and serve the idols. Now, verse 19 tells me God sent them prophets, but I'm learning a very powerful thing. We're going to learn about prophets tonight as time permits, but I learn about the role of the prophet. A prophet was not merely one who foretold the future. This is the real role of the prophet. What do you learn from verse 19? God sent prophets to bring them back. Yeah, God sent prophets to bring them back and to testify against them, but they wouldn't listen, the text said. Now, verse 20, a little problem here. Not a problem, but just a little discrepancy we need to deal with. That the Spirit of the Lord came upon Zechariah. That's not the Zechariah of the prophet Zechariah that wrote the book of Zechariah. He's in the post-exile period, so it's a different time period. So it's a different Zechariah. But it is the Zechariah mentioned that Jesus mentioned, I think it is anyway, of Matthew 23 and in verse 25. And why is that? Because the description seems to be the same, though there's a little discrepancy in the identification. That Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, the priest, more likely was a grandson because of the age, one thing, And the father must be the one, and this is some conjecture, I recognize, the one that's mentioned, and I'll let you turn, and I'm not going to take the time to go to Matthew 23:35, but that seems to mention the father, and this is the grandfather. Make sense? And so the Bible often talks about the son of, when actually it's not the literal son, but it may be the grandson or great-grandson of someone. It means a descendant of. But anyway, Zechariah came, and what does Zechariah say? Why have you... Yeah, because you've forsaken, and so you're not going to prosper because you've forsaken the Lord. But he didn't listen. He conspired against him and stoned him on the court of the house of the Lord. Now that fits the description of what Jesus talked about in Matthew 23, so I think it's probably the same guy. Now verse 22, Joash the king did not remember the kindness of Jehoiada, his father, and your footnote will identify him at verse 22 as a foster father, or it may be a grandfather. But anyway, he didn't remember the kindness that was done to him, but killed his sons. And so he forgot. And we have a tendency to forget. All right, let's move on to his death, 23 to 27, and we're going to leave 2 Chronicles 24 alone here after this. What do we know about his death? Syria came up against him. Yeah. And the army of the Syrians came with a small company, but the Lord delivered them, a great army, into his hand, and the hand of Syria. Why? Verse 24. Because they had forsaken the Lord. Now that's the storyline of 1st and 2nd Kings, by the way. If we're missing that, it's not just to keep up, okay, I want to remember how long this king reigned. Did he reign 40 years, or was it 42 years, or 52 years, or was it 7 years? That's not those are interesting things to remember. We've got to keep up, and that must be important because God mentions that. But the storyline in 1st and 2nd Kings, unless I missed it, is the storyline of how the people forsook the Lord and the nation suffered because of it. Does that make sense? So this king did evil, and the people did evil, and they forsook the Lord, and so God brought punishment upon them. They turned back to the Lord, so God blessed them, and then they turned away from the Lord, and the Lord didn't bless them. It's a story. That's the storyline. And so that's what we need to be watching for throughout the book. Now, verse 25, he was severely wounded in the battle. The King James will say diseased. I think the preferred translation would be wounded somehow because it was from a battle. And so his own servants conspired, and the sons of Jehoiada, the priest, killed him in his bed, and so he died. All right, anything else on his death or on his apostasy or the repairs of the temple?
I was just thinking how this resembles the Cain and Abel story, in that, God said to him, if you do well, will you not, your countenance be lifted up? And basically he's saying to the prophet came to him and said, you want to know why things aren't going well in your kingdom? This is why your things are going. And his response to that was kill the messenger.
Yeah.
Cain's response was kill his brother.
Absolutely.
So
we haven't changed. We haven't changed. And fast forward to 2021, we still haven't changed. Shoot the messenger. You may not literally shoot him, but you reject him. You might shoot him. But you want to get rid of the messenger. That's true. All right, let's go to 2 Kings 13 now. 2 Kings 13. We're going to talk about the reign of Jehoahaz in Israel and the reign of Joash, or Jehoash, same man in Israel, the death of Elisha. And so we're going to work our way through chapter 13. I know we have some ground to cover, but let's take a moment to see where we are now. Here's the timeline that we have been following, and we're up here. And Jehoahaz and Jehoash, or that's also known as Joash. And I know there's a Joash down here, not to be confused. We're in the north now. And so we're talking about these two kings right here. And so let's go forward and get our timetable. Let me back up just a little bit. Jehoahaz is right here for 17 years, and Joash is for 16 years. And because they're in the north, always in the north, the kings are good or bad. Always bad in the north. We don't have a good king in the north at all. Very few good ones in the south. And so basically the kings are bad. All right, let's talk about the reign of Jehoahaz in Israel. And so we're going to work through 2 Kings 13. We won't go to Chronicles till we get to chapter 14 here in a moment. So this ought to go rather quickly here. Verses 1 and 2, what do we know about his doing evil? He reigned for 17 years. Yes, and did not depart from them. So he's a bad king. In other words, he didn't follow the Lord and then apostatized as the last king we just mentioned in the south. But he started in a leadership of sin. He stayed in a leadership of sin, and there he went. Now let's talk about the consequences of this opposition, of being oppressed. And that's what the OPP stands for up here, is really oppressed. The consequences, they were oppressed by Syria, or of Syria. And so Syria's to their north. So the Lord sends Syria. Why, verse 3, the Lord send Syria? Because his anger was kindled because of the sin of verse 2. So the Lord sends Syria to be an oppressor. Now then, Jehoahaz pleaded with the Lord, verse 4, I'm sorry. And the Lord saw his oppression, and because the king of Syria oppressed them. And so, verse 5, moving to point 3 here, the Lord sent a deliverer. The deliverer is not identified here. Historically, that probably refers to the Syrian army. By the Lord sending a deliverer, probably wasn't a prophet here, but the Lord sent some relief from another source, and it probably was the Assyrian army. Historically, that did take place. Now, verse 6 and 7 is what I'm interested in, because this hits the storyline of our book. What does verse 6 and 7 say? He did evil. God sent an oppressor, and I'm sorry? Nevertheless. What happens? They don't change. Very good. I see stubbornness in verse 6. Nevertheless, they did not depart from the sins of the house of Jeroboam, but walked in them, and they had the wooden images, etc. For he left the army, of the army of Jehoahaz only 50 horsemen and 10 chariots and 10,000. In other words, and made the army like the dust at thrashing. What does that mean? Basically ground the army to powder, didn't it? Nothing left. And so the army's been kind of obliterated. But even though that took place, here's a strong point to learn. Verse 6, they didn't make a change. God sent an oppressor, and when they cry out, God gives them deliverance. It still didn't change. No change at all. All right, now verses 8 and 9 is his death, Jehoahaz, and said he died, and he rested with his fathers, and they buried him, and Joash, his son, reigned in his place. So we have Jehoahaz reigned for 17 years, and then we're going to see Joash for 16 years. So now let's talk about the reign of Joash. He's also known as Jehoash. And let's look at 10 to 13, and then we'll focus on the death of Elisha. What happens here in the reign of Joash? Verse 10 through verse 13. Absolutely. Verse 11. Verse 11, he reigned, the 16-year reign, he didn't depart from evil. And so basically the rest of it says he died and he was buried and his reign is over. So they had 17 years of reign of evil, and now they have another 16 years reign of evil. That does quite a number to a nation. Now the death of Elisha is quite telling here. This is a historical point. All these are historical points, I assume. But Elisha became sick, and who came to see him? King of Israel, Joash. And he came down and he wept over his face, and he said, "Oh, my father, the chariots of Israel and their horsemen." Now, I've been to see several people who are on their deathbed, and knew this was the last conversation with them, but I have never said to them the phrase, O Father, my Father, the chariots of Israel and their horsemen. Why would he say that? Say again? Yes. Let's go back. Oh, yes, I think you're right. There's a reason he said that, and because that phrase was not just a coincidental phrase that he just pulled out of the sky that happened to be the same phrase that had been used before. Go back to 2:12, 2 Kings 2:12. Elisha himself is uttering this phrase at the death, or at the ascending, not the death, but the ascending of Elijah. Elijah's going away. Now, verse 12, Elisha saw it when he saw the chariots of fire. Verse 11, he said, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And so he saw him no more. Now, when Elisha is dying, the king of Israel comes to him and says the very same phrase. The same words are used. I think what he's suggesting is, in both places, the best of earthly defense is now leaving. We're losing our greatest protector. And just like you said to Elijah, I say to you, the horsemen and the chariots were their defense. And so it's hard for us to relate, okay, horsemen and chariots, that may not mean a lot to us, but if you want to think of our military defense, you think of our bombs and our planes and our ships, etc. You think of the best and the strongest we've got. And the horses and the chariots, if a nation had chariots and they had horsemen, they had great defense. And so with the passing of Elijah, or I don't mean his death, but Elijah, when he left, they were losing their defense. But now we have Elisha. Now he's dying. They're losing this strong defense. And as Melissa said, he was a secret weapon at times. I think that's the point. So Elisha says to him, take an arrow, and what does he tell him to do with it? Take your bow and take your arrow, and here's what I want you to do. All right, open the window and shoot the arrow. How many arrows? We're not told. But he must have been told, and I'm going to tell you why I think that. There is some conjecture there. And shoot it, and the arrow of the Lord's deliverance and the arrow of deliverance from Syria, for you must strike the Syrians at Aphek till you have destroyed them. So this was a prophecy. You're going to destroy them. And then he said, take the arrows. And so he took them and he said, strike the ground, and now what? 3 times and stopped. Was Elisha very happy with that? 5 or 6 times. Now, how would he know that? I'm not sure. But it must have been, take it when, for example, let me just footnote here and forget this text. Quite often a reference of a speech, like in Acts 2 even, the sermon, I think there may have been more said than what's recorded. But all we have is what's recorded. There may have been more in this discussion than what's recorded here. And there must have been, maybe it was the number of arrows that he had shot out the window, or the number of arrows he had in his hand. There was some reason that Elisha thought he knew he should have hit it 5 or 6 times, or else why rebuke him for something he would have no reason of knowing. But he said, but now you'll strike Israel only 3 times, Syria only 3 times. You only have 3 strikes against them. You would have had 5 or 6. And so that's going to be fulfilled a little bit later. Now, in his death, when Elijah died, they put him in tomb. Then there's a raid. What happens now in this raid sometime later? There's the bones of Elisha. Don't you know that was a surprise to him and everybody? Another testimony of, remember the 3 chapters I said go together as a unit, and you had the miracles, and you had the floating axe head, and the Syrians, etc. All this is testimony to who Elisha was. Here's more testimony to that. That Elisha, whatever he said, whatever he did, whatever prophecy he made, had to be true, because when another man touched his bones, he came to life. And he truly was a man of God. Good point. Good point. All right, let's talk about the last part of chapter 13. Israel regains city from the Syrians. Let's see what happens here. You tell me. Verses 22 to 25. Hazael, king of Syria, oppressed Israel all the days of Jehoahaz, and the Lord had compassion on them. Why? Yeah, because of what he had promised. And so Hazael and Ben-Hadad, who reigned in his place, they fought against the people of God. Look at verse 25. And Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, recaptured from the hand of Ben-Hadad all that was taken from Jehoahaz his father. And 3 times he defeated him and recaptured the cities of Israel. And so there was the fulfillment of that prophecy. Now, more could be said, but let's move on to chapter 14 now. Chapter 14, we have the reign of Amaziah in Judah and of Jeroboam the second in Israel. So we're going to jump back and forth between the kings. Just as a footnote, 1st and 2nd Kings and Chronicles as well are not in true chronology, but in general chronology. What would I mean by that?
It's not exact. It's in the way that the writer tells it, not the way it really happened.
Yeah, sometimes there may be an event that's mentioned in a chapter here that actually was a little bit before that because of the order of telling it. But the author is going, it gets confusing. I hear people say this, that it gets confusing jumping from the north to the south and north to the south. But he's taking it generally chronological, jumping from the north to the south. Is that making sense? Rather than going through the nation of Israel all the way from beginning to end, now let's go back and get Judah from beginning to end. He's taking the kingdoms generally going north and south, north and south, north and south, north and south, working our way toward the end. So it's generally chronological. Make sense?
Kind of like what happens in our history books when we're teaching about the Civil War.
Yes. Yeah. Any history book will do that. You go for a little bit and then you jump back a little bit and then you come forward, but you generally are going in chronological order. Chapter 14 now. Let's talk about Amaziah. He's in Judah. And we're going to work through this and take the 2nd Chronicles account, only looking at what is not mentioned in Kings. So we'll take brief note of that. Let's talk about his reign, verses 1 to 6. What do we see in his reign, verses 1 to 6? All right, very good. He is labeled, at least on the graphic I've been using, as a good and bad king. How long did he reign? 29 years. And he did what was right in the sight, but not like his father. The high places remained. What does that mean? Yeah, they didn't root out all the sin. Still worshiped idols there. And so he murdered the murderers. He took care of the murderers of his father, but he didn't execute the children of their murderers. Why? Because of the law of Moses, it mentioned here at verse 6. Deuteronomy 24:16 would be that law. All right, that gets us through verses 1 to 6. Briefly, and you might hold a finger over here and turn over to 2 Chronicles 25, the first 4 verses. Only one verse is mentioned there. There are 4 verses, but there's only one that has got a little thought there that's not mentioned in Kings. Verse 2, he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, but not with a loyal heart. That phrase is not found in Kings. So he did what was right. You know of people that way. They generally do what's right, but not with a loyal heart. And he was labeled as a good and a bad king. Let's go to verse 7 now. Verse 7 in 2 Kings 14 mentions the killing of 10,000 Edomites. So he had war against the Edomites. Chronicles gives us more details about that, starting at verse 5 through verse 16. So Chronicles is more thorough this time. And so this is quite interesting now. Starting at verse 5, what does he do to fight against the Edomites? He basically hires, Yeah, some men from Israel to come and help fight, but a man of God, he's not identified. A man of God means he is a prophet. And so a prophet comes to him, not identified, and tells him basically what? Don't do that. You don't need to do that. And that if you go, but even so, God will make you fall before the enemy. And so God has the power to do that, and God will do that. Well, it's interesting, Amaziah raised a question now. What are we going to do about the money? And what was he told? Don't worry about it. Here's a very practical answer. There are times you don't worry about money. Sometimes we're worried to death about money. We're worried about every dime we spend. And there are times that you just don't worry about the money. The money's been spent, but that's not what God wants you to do, then just forget the money. There's some things more important than money. And there are times you just don't worry about that. But what about the money? That'd make a good sermon, wouldn't it? What about the money? You know, it may be my work that's hindering my service to the Lord, but what about the money? There are times you don't worry about the money. Or here's what it's going to cost. Sometimes you don't worry about that. And he was worried about the money. But anyway, I'll get off of that soapbox and drop on down to verse 14. That after Amaziah came from the slaughter of the Edomites, that he brought back the gods of the people. What am I learning here at 14 and 15? He went to battle, but when he comes back from the Edomites, what does he bring with him? Brought their gods back with him. And the anger of the Lord was aroused against him. And so God sent a prophet to him saying that the very gods that could not lead their people and rescue their people, you brought them back? What a loser. What a loser. What else do you see down through verse 16? That we need to mention. Yes, verse 16. Yeah, told him to cease. In other words, stop, hush. I don't want to hear any more of what you got to say. I'm done listening to you. And so that was quite often the case. Now there's... That's an interesting point. Yeah, didn't negate that, oh, you're not true. You're not right in what you say. As you said, he insults him. That's a good point. Let's talk about the war with Israel, verses 8 to 14. We're back in 2 Kings 14. What about the war with Israel? Starting at verse 8. He sent a messenger to the king of Israel. Yeah, let's face one another in battle. Let's have a battle. Now, verse 9 is quite interesting. This deserves a little bit of a comment. That Jehoash, king of Israel, said to Amaziah, king of Judah, the thistle that was in Lebanon sent to the cedar that was in Lebanon, saying, give your daughter to my son his wife, and a wild beast that was in Lebanon passed by and trampled the thistle. Now, that's probably, you've heard that before when one president talks to another president about whether we're going to have war. Right? What a phrase. Let's see if we can make some sense of that. Pulpits suggest, and I think they're probably correct, they quote Josephus, and Josephus claims, he was that Jewish historian, that he has a more thorough historical record of what was actually sent. I won't go through reading that. You can check Pulpit on that. But the thistle is basically a thorn bush. It was a wild, as the meanest thing in the vegetable world, according to Pulpit. And so you have the thistle, and the cedar would be thought to be the grandest thing. In other words, it's a put down to the king of Israel saying, you're saying you're the thistle and I'm the cedar, and you think you're on an equality. And that's the idea of the phrase that give your daughter to my son. If even in our own day and time, if we think that the other family is inferior, we don't want our children to marry them. Whether that's right or wrong, whether that's the right attitude, isn't that pretty much the case? So if I would want my son to marry your daughter, my daughter to marry your son, that suggests that we are equal. And he is saying, you think we're equal somehow. We ain't equal, I'm going to tell you. You're a little thistle and I'm a cedar. And you want me to go to battle with you? No, we're not equal. You're going to be trampled. Yeah. Look at verse 10. He rebukes him for his arrogance. You indeed have defeated Edom, and your heart is lifted up. And you're going to fall, both you and Judah. And so that's what that was all about. Now, what else do you see down through verse 14? We're about to run out of time here.
King of Israel sent him, he defeated them, he tore down the walls, he took their treasury.
Yeah.
He said, like, stay at home, these things are going to happen.
Exactly. Let's get 15 through verse 20, actually. I said through 22, but actually 21 and 22 goes with another section. Just deals with his death, and after his death, Jeroboam reigns. Now, let's go on and get Jeroboam the second. Now, we call him Jeroboam the second, though he's never labeled as that in the text. Why do we call him Jeroboam the second? I mentioned that a moment ago. Or you may read from someone they call him Jeroboam B. That's not an initial for his last name. We've already had a Jeroboam, just distinguishing one Jeroboam from another. So this is Jeroboam the second, or Jeroboam B, however you want to distinguish him. And what do we know about his reign, 23 to 29? Now, here's an interesting thought right here at verse 25. You're exactly right. Did evil in the sight of the Lord. He restored territory, even though he was evil. He's a bad king, reigned 41 years. He restored the territory of Israel from the entrance of Hamath to the sea of Arabah, according to the word of the Lord, which he sent through the prophet Jonah. That's the Jonah of the book of Jonah. Same Jonah who went to Nineveh. Same Jonah. So now, this is historical evidence. Here we have a historical reference that's referencing Jonah. Many have discredited Jonah. Why? Yeah, he was swallowed by a great fish. That couldn't have happened. That's not true. So you discredit Jonah. Here is historical reference giving credibility to Jonah. Does that make sense? All right, here's a text of inspiration giving credibility to Jonah. All right. And so he basically recaptured from Damascus to Hamath. In other words, from the Sea of Galilee north a good ways, that section is what was recaptured. And he fulfilled the prophecy that was spoken by Jonah the prophet. All right. I know this is kind of hurried. But let's go to 2 Chronicles 26. We're going to talk about another king quickly, and we've got about a minute or two to go. Chapter 25, we kind of skipped of 2 Chronicles. Most of that dealt with what was parallel that we just saw from 2 Kings 14. So this is Uzziah. Now let's get a reference. Let me just make a quick reference to this, and our time's going to be gone. But let's talk about this. This is Uzziah right here, or Azariah, same man. And so let's go on to our next map. And here he is, Uzziah. He was a good king. He reigned for 52 years. What prophet mentions him? That his work started and covered the time period of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. This king, this prophet, right? Isaiah. Isaiah 1:1 mentions this king. Okay? So Isaiah's on the scene now. And so has Hosea been on the scene. And so has Amos been on the scene. Amaziah, we've been talking about, Amos dealt with him. So quickly, we've got just a moment to deal with this. What do we know about his reign? Verses 1 to 6. We're in 2 Chronicles 26. Verse 4 said he did right. He sought God in the days of Zechariah. That's not the Zechariah now of the book of Zechariah. So verses 1 to 5, he did what was right. He had a battle with the Philistines, verses 6 to 8. What else did he do in verses 9 and 10? Yes. He built up the city and he fortified its armies, mentioned in 11 to 15. But now let's talk about his pride quickly. What did he do wrong? He went,
He went into the temple to burn incense.
yes. Look at verse 18. The priest withstood him, saying, "It is not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense." Here's a lesson on authority. He's doing something good, but he wasn't the right person for it. Make sense? The lesson about authority. It is not for you. He became furious, the text says. And we're going to have to end at that note. But there's a lesson about authority there. Became a leper because of that. So he was punished. Reminds us of Nadab and Abihu.